Verse 30, those who know me as the one that governs the material and the divine aspects and all sacrifices, they with their minds harmonized have wisdom of me even at the time of departure from here. Shri Krishna, if you look at it, he uses the words Prayankar, the first word on the third line. What is the meaning of this word? Shri Krishna has created so many questions from this last verse of the 7th chapter. We will see one thing here, Prayankar. Shri Krishna does not use the word Antakar, which means the time of end, but he uses the word Prayankar, time of departure from here. What does Prayankar mean? It means that one is to depart from here and can come back here. Look at it. Time of departure. One departs here and comes back here. Shri Krishna has used the word Prayankar for death. One can only call that Prayan, which has to go and come back. Antakar is that which goes and does not come back. Shri Krishna is saying that death is such an event where after going on to, as to come back, and even at that time, such people know him and remember him. Shri Krishna uses the word Viduhu, which is a second word on the last line in this verse, meaning that such people know him. What is this wisdom? This wisdom is not information. Wisdom is firstly recognizing what ignorance is. A thinker said it very nicely that information is the beginning of knowledge, knowledge is the beginning of wisdom, and wisdom is that awareness of ignorance. I'll repeat that again. Information is the beginning of knowledge, knowledge is the beginning of wisdom, and wisdom is that awareness of ignorance. When we start gathering information and learn about what the different scriptures say, then as we attain this information, then this information is the beginning of knowledge. Knowledge is the beginning of wisdom. As one attains knowledge, then one develops one's understanding and one's wisdom increases. What is true wisdom? Wisdom is the awareness of ignorance. When a person gets wisdom, then he realizes what he does not know. The balloon of what the person knows does not expand. The person becomes aware about what he does not know. This is viduhu. This knowledge is such that it can be attained from learning. What Shri Krishna is saying here is that this knowledge is such that it is attained after forgetting something. Normally, knowledge is such that it comes after running and making efforts. What Shri Krishna is saying here is that this knowledge is such that this knowledge does not come from running, but from being steady. The words that Shri Krishna is used in this verse, such as Sadi Deva, Sadi Yagna, and Sadi Bhuta, Brahma, Akhilam Karma, Adhyatma, etc. Normally, knowledge is such where to attain it, one has to go on a very long journey and work hard. But the knowledge that Shri Krishna is talking about in this verse is such that a person needs to go within himself. A person has to look within himself. Knowledge is disintegrating the clouds of ignorance floating in the sky of the soul. After this purity and cleanliness fill up the sky of the soul, then this is true knowledge. The knowledge that we collect for our whole lives, in reality creates confusion in our lives. There is an event in Buddha's life where his disciples were waiting and Buddha came. After coming there for a while, Buddha sat down quietly. The pupils thought that Buddha would say something soon. Buddha took out a nice silky handkerchief from his pocket and tied that handkerchief into 5 knots. Then Buddha asked the question that you saw the handkerchief when I bought it, and now you see this handkerchief after I've tied it in 5 knots. Give me the answer to my question, whether there is any difference between the handkerchief without any knots and the handkerchief with knots. Anyone? What's the difference between the handkerchief without any knots and the handkerchief with 5 knots? The pupils fell into confusion. One pupil stood up and said, Tathagat, what they addressed Buddha as, we have understood your question and you are putting us into confusion. In both ways, you have kept the answer to this question yourself. Lord, we understand your tactics. If we say that it is not the same handkerchief, then you will ask us how it's not there. The handkerchief is there with its designs and colors. The handkerchief has a value. No difference has actually been made to the handkerchief in tying the knots. The same handkerchief is there, and if we say that it is the same handkerchief, then you argue that it's not the same handkerchief. You have tied knots on the handkerchief that has no knots. You could have put something inside it, or could have covered yourself with a handkerchief, but now that these knots have been tied, you cannot put anything inside it and you cannot cover yourself with it. The use of the handkerchief has changed, the shape of the handkerchief has changed, and therefore the handkerchief itself has changed. If we try to look at it spiritually, then what you can do with the handkerchief without knots cannot be done with the handkerchief with knots. The handkerchief is different because the quality has changed and because the utility has changed. Tathagat, now you tell us what you're trying to explain here. This, Buddha said, that which is true for the handkerchief is also true about life. While life is open and without knots, then until then there are many possibilities. It can be tied, it can be used, and etc. Many different things can happen in life. It is also possible that while the handkerchief is open, then one can tie knots in the handkerchief. That is also a possibility. But once the knot is tied, then the possibilities are reduced. The possibilities are reduced. Life remains as such was after being tied, but what the majority of us do in life is that in the name of knowledge, in the name of understanding, in the name of wisdom, in the name of experience, in the name of religion, in the name of cleverness, people keep trying these knots in their lives. The more the knots in one's life, then the less useful that the life becomes. This is because the existence that has been given to us from the Supreme Soul was only for one reason: bliss. The Supreme Soul is himself bliss, and the Supreme Soul gave this individual soul form a part of himself. The Supreme Soul gave only one goal for this: bliss. But the more knotted that the human being becomes in prejudices, then the more that his potentiality, his usefulness, and his utility reduces. Going towards a pure existence free of scriptures is true wisdom. Wisdom should not tie a person in knots. Wisdom should liberate a person. Sa vidyaya vimuktaya. Wisdom should liberate a person. Once a human being goes towards such a wisdom, then he can never forget the Supreme Soul at any moment. Not only that, but at the time of departure from here, as it said in this verse, the person remembers God. What is the meaning of the words that Shri Krishna has used in the 29th and 30th verses of this chapter? Scroll back and you see these words. It says, Brahmas, Akhilam Karma, Adhyatma, Adibhuta, Adideva, Adiyagna. The questions that come into our minds while seeing these words are also asked by Arjun to Shri Krishna during the beginning verses of the 8th chapter of the Gita. The first two verses of the 8th chapter are filled with questions to God. The first verse asks, Kintad Brahman Kimatmanam Kinkarma Purushottama Adibhuta Tanchaki Pruktam Adireva Kim Chayate. What is Brahman, or the Absolute? What is the Self? And what is action, or the best of persons? What is said to be the domain of elements? What is called the domain of the gods? Therefore, the questions that Shri Krishna gave rise to the end of the 7th chapter and the spiritual terminology that Shri Krishna has used, Shri Krishna will give answers to these questions at the beginning of the 8th chapter of the Gita. If we wish to understand what Brahman, the self, action, the domain of the elements, and the domain of the gods, as well as many other things, then we should read and study the 8th chapter of the Gita. God says that one should apply this 7th chapter of the Gita in his one life, because the message that Shri Krishna gave to us in the 7th chapter was wisdom backed up with science. It's called Gnan Vignan Yog, wisdom together with science. Wisdom after knowing which there remains nothing left to be known, and irrevocable wisdom. Ashanshaya samagranam yata gnanaschinan. The Supreme Soul has given us this wisdom in full, and we have to make efforts for this and apply this in our lives. Only then will the Supreme Soul tell us about spiritual wisdom. That's the end of this chapter, end of the 7th chapter of the Gita. Let's close with the Gita Mahatma on the last page.